Beatles fans, rejoice. It was just announced that Martin Scorsese is directing a new Beatles documentary. Yes, we're getting another Beatles documentary. This one is Beatles 64, and it's going to be chronicling what became known as Beatlemania as the Beatles came to the United States. This is one of the most momentous occasions in rock history, and this documentary is supposed to get deep into the details as we, the viewers, will get to follow along and join Paul McCartney, John Lennon, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr as they embarked on one of the most iconic ascensions in music history. Now, Martin Scorsese is technically producing this one. David Tedeschi is actually technically the director of this one. And this, by the way, will be Martin Scorsese's second Beatles documentary. Remember, he had that George Harrison Living in a Material World documentary a few years ago. And we are just coming on the heels of that Peter Jackson produced Get Back Beatles documentary. So here's the thing about the Beatles. They are arguably the most covered band, past, present, future, most covered recording artists, arguably, in music history. I mean, there is so much literature. There are so many documentaries. There are so many re-releases of their music, yet there doesn't seem to be a case of Beatles fatigue. This is just one of those stories and one of those legendary runs that doesn't get old. And no matter what angle you cover their career from, you could always uncover new gems and gain new insights. So I'm wondering, what is this documentary gonna give us that we haven't been given already? Because let's think about this. I would say that the best Beatles documentary, now again, there's several, but if I had to pick one Beatles documentary that I consider to be the best, it would be the Beatles Anthology. And that's because it's the most comprehensive. I mean, it takes you back to pre-Quarrymen, when these guys were meeting each other, and it gives you the background on each one of the members, and then talks about who met who in school to start the band, and then who came along. So it takes you to their childhood, has interviews with Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr, some old interview footage from John Lennon, you get George Martin, and you get George Harrison, and it's got different interviews from different times, so you're basically able to cover the different phases within the Beatles career. Again, it's super comprehensive. So if you want a one-stop shop to get the most complete Beatles story, I would direct you right over to that Beatles Anthology. It came out with a re-release of their music where you get all the mono recordings, the stereo recordings, and there was a book that accompanied what was a TV series turned documentary film. It's like a set of DVDs basically. So I would point to that one as being the best Beatles documentary. And again, it's not the only one. They've got several different Beatles documentaries. So what do you do when you've got a band or an artist that is this well covered to try to keep things interesting? Well, you could start diving in to those particular phases of their career, like they did with that Peter Jackson produced Get Back. They took you to the stressful preparation of that rooftop performance, as well as the preparation, or what became the 1970 Let It Be Beatles album. That's like the final Beatles album to be released, not the last one to be recorded. That would have been Abbey Road, but the last one to be released, Let It Be. So yeah, you could dive into the individual parts of the story. So in this case, it looks like Martin Scorsese and that team are diving into Beatles 1964, very pivotal time. I mean, they had dropped by this point Love Me Do in 1963, She Loves You, From Me to You, P.S. I Love You, I Want to Hold Your Hand. This is all 1963. Then you get into 1964 with Please Please Me, the album and the song All My Loving, which is one of my favorite early Beatles songs. Just that tune, Close Your Eyes and All. Like, I love that song, All My Loving. So yeah, they had done that. They had done the Isley Brothers cover of Twist and Shout. Their version, the Beatles version, is the one that became the world famous version. The one that was performed on Ferris Bueller's Day Off, Twist and Shout, Can't Buy Me Love. And remember, some of these singles are reaching #1 at this point. So they come to America in 64 with that batch of songs. And then later in 64, they'll have like Hard Day's Night, the album and the movie, because that's how quickly they became a multimedia phenomenon. So yeah, Hard Day's Night, they had Do You Want to Know a Secret, which ended up appearing on the Beatles' second album. So if you were in the UK, I think it was called the Beatles' second album. If you were in the US, it would have been Meet the Beatles. But these songs were recorded after they came to America and became a phenomenon, right? Hard Day's Night and those other songs. But that first batch that I gave you, many of those they already had when they came to America. So when they had their iconic Ed Sullivan, that probably the most famous Ed Sullivan performance ever. Let me know if you think, if you could think of a bigger, more momentous Ed Sullivan performance. But Beatlemania and them hitting the Ed Sullivan Show in February of 1964. So this is early 64, right? That's why this Beatles 64 thing is such a deal, because they came early 64 and hit the Ed Sullivan Show 3 different times in February of 64, instantly became a phenomenon in the US. I mean, they were a phenomenon by the time their plane landed. So I think that this documentary is going to get into that. It's going to get into the inner workings and the relationships between the members, how they kind of dealt and coped with the stress as they were becoming this mega celebrity in the US and, you know, abroad, around the world. Like, they spread like wildfire. So this is supposed to have never before seen footage. So you're going to get that, because again, I'm wondering, what is this going to give us? That anthology, which covered this section of the Beatles' career very well. What can this documentary give us? So it's going to give us some never before seen footage. It's going to give us new interviews. So I'm thinking it's probably got more recent interviews. That's the only thing I could think of, because, you know, their vault and their archives of interviews have pretty much been mined for these different documentaries. So new interviews from the surviving members: Paul McCartney, Ringo, Starr. George Martin passed away a few years ago. But yeah, I want to see that plane landing at JFK Airport on February 7th of 64. So think about it. Their plane landed on February 7th, 1964. They were on Ed Sullivan February 9th. 2 days later. So this was a quick and sudden occurrence. It was anticipated, and the Beatles, career-wise, never really looked back. It was just off to the races by that point. Again, movies, albums, they stopped touring like in 65, ended up becoming studio rats, where they would then release Rubber Soul, Revolver, Sgt. Pepper's, the Magic Mystery Tour, which became an album, was a collection of songs. Then they had, you know, the White Album, Abbey Road, and Let It Be. By the way, I would love to see a documentary cover that 1965 up to Sgt. Pepper era. Like, I'm talking maybe everything from Beatles for Sale, going through the Rubber Soul, Revolver, basically when the Beatles went from becoming bona fide hit makers, because this Beatles 64 is before all this that I'm talking about now. But I want to see a documentary that chronicles the Beatles transition, like when they, you know, met Dylan and were inspired to make more existential and more thoughtful music, when they really became those more sophisticated songwriters. Because yes, they were cranking out hits in 63 and 64. But John Lennon, you know, and Paul McCartney and George Harrison, they turned a corner and they became more existential, a little bit more melancholy. You could hear that especially in John Lennon's writing. Like, listen to my favorite Beatles song, In My Life, from Rubber Soul. So yeah, I would love to see a documentary dive into that 65, 66 up to 67 period. I think that would be very interesting. But here we've got Beatles 64, the height of Beatlemania. Although you could argue that going into 65 might have been the height of it. I don't know. What would you say the height of Beatlemania was? Was it the plane landing at JFK and then them appearing at the Ed Sullivan Show and then the next few months to follow? Or was it when the Beatles took to the stage at Shea Stadium, at the time the biggest concert ever, you know, so loud that they stopped wanting to perform live because they couldn't even hear themselves play, because these crowds were so raucous and the stages were so mega, to where it must have been a far cry from when they were honing their chops in 61 and 62, right? When they were kind of touring much of Europe in a van, basically, when they were paying their dues. Shea Stadium would have been like the polar opposite of small clubs in Germany and so forth, right? So even within Beatlemania, there are different little mini sub phases within Beatlemania. Because if you think about it, Beatlemania really was a phenomenon until sometime in 65. By the time they got to Revolver, Sgt. Pepper, yeah, they were still the biggest band in the world, easily, but the novelty had worn off. I mean, think about it. No matter who you think of as a major beloved artist, there's the wave when they first hit and they capture the public's imagination, and then it's about either trying to outdo yourself as an artist or trying to sustain that type of success and fame. The Beatles have had different stages of their career, and again, they went from becoming a hit-making machine in 63 and 64 to being a classic album-making artist 65, 66, 67, throughout the rest of the Beatles' career, basically. But that initial shot in the arm when they took America by storm was a very unique thing, and that's what's being captured here in this Martin Scorsese documentary. So yeah, I'm wondering, I'm curious. I want to see how much they can give us that they didn't give us already. I mean, look, there was an 8 days a week documentary, which 8 days a week was just after this period that we're talking about. 8 days a week was like the beginning of 65. But that's another, it's a classic Beatles song, but it's also another really good documentary. Check out Beatles 8 days a week. So yeah, there's no shortage of Beatles multimedia coverage, movies, books, anything you could think of, merchandise, anything you could think of. Beatles have been thoroughly covered. So I want to see what nuance or what new insights we can get from this Beatles 64 documentary, which comes out on Disney Plus on November 29th. So that's just a month and a half away. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to this one. I would also like to see a documentary on the relationship between the Beatles and Brian Epstein, who tragically passed away shortly after the release of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Very tragic, died very young, and he was basically, he was like the fifth Beatle before Billy Preston became the fifth Beatle, essentially during that Let It Be, Get Back era. So I would like to see that examined. So there are different ways of covering the Beatles. You could talk about their friendly rivalry between them and the Beach Boys, between them and the Rolling Stones. You could talk about the preparation of All You Need Is Love for that broadcast when they were putting together new songs around and just after the time of Sgt. Pepper. So there are several ways that you could keep the Beatles story coverage very interesting. We'll see how they pull it off with this Beatles 64 documentary. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Let me know your thoughts on this one. What are you expecting? First of all, what is your favorite Beatles documentary up to this point? Again, I would have to say the Beatles Anthology. It takes several sit downs to watch that whole thing because it's like 8 DVDs long. That's how comprehensive it is. But yeah, let me know your favorite Beatles documentary. What do you expect to gain out of this Beatles 64 documentary, and what other parts of the Beatles career would you like to see covered and thoroughly examined through a documentary? And also, if you have a favorite Beatles book, let me know what that is in the comments. Like the video, subscribe to the channel if you love music like I do. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.